Egypt's interim leader, Adli Mansour, has outlined his timetable for new elections, but this comes amid continued unrest with at least 51 people killed in Cairo. So was the ousting of the Muslim Brotherhood's President Morsi from the presidency a blow for or against democracy? What was the Christian minority's role in the ousting, and what does it mean for the region? Well, to shed some light on a very complex situation, we're joined tonight by foreign policy analyst Dr. Stephen Hoadley from Auckland University. Stephen, thank you for sparing time for us. Egypt is going from what appears to be bad to worse. What's actually happened in terms of the revolution? This is the revolution to the revolution?
Yes, good evening, Alan. It is a revolution within a revolution. The initial revolution was by the moderates expelling, essentially a military dictator with a one-party rule. The new revolution now is increasingly from the streets. We see a lot of very undisciplined action, passionate action, righteous action, but without order, without structure, without institutions to guide and channel this enormous energy that we see in the streets of Egypt.
Because the Muslim Brotherhood was saying that this was a military coup and that it was the army backing the rebels that brought the president down. The military in Egypt seems to have a significant role in these events.
They do, and they had a role beforehand as well. That is, Morsi ruled with the permission and the support of the army that helped to turn the tide against Mubarak. And once the army lost confidence in Morsi, then of course it was all over. That just shows us the real power in Egypt lies in military hands at the end of the day. Was it a military coup? I think the jury is still out. I would say it is, but it might be a good one. That is, there are good coups and there are bad coups. Now, if they turn over power quickly to the civilians, if there's a constitution written very quickly, if there's a new election and that election result is abided by, then I think we'll applaud the military for doing the right thing. So we have to look at the quality of these military coups, not just whether it's a military action or not.
Because what seems to be emerging is that people feel that their revolution was hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, that it had started as a revolution against the Mubarak regime, and suddenly they find themselves being replaced, having a president replaced with something that actually wasn't much better in the end.
You mentioned the word people. Well, there are people and there are people. And the problem with this kind of transfer of power is that the number of people on the streets may not represent the silent majority or the intense minorities in the political system. Only a proper election which registers everyone and records their votes will give you an accurate reflection. So yes, different groups of people have supported the Muslim Brotherhood and now oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood now are enjoying perhaps a resurgence. A lot of people in the middle may feel that they've been hard done by. Remember that 90% of the population of Egypt is Muslim, and there's a kind of built-in sympathy for at least Muslim parties, if not that particular party, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Because what's been quite interesting, talking to journalists who are working in Egypt, they're saying that Coptic Christians have been working alongside moderate Muslims against both regimes, the Morsi regime and the earlier ones.
Although I'd qualify that slightly, that the Coptic Christians did have a working arrangement with the Mubarak regime. Mubarak did support for a period of time the protection of the Copts. The Copts were originally the wealthiest class in Egypt. They made up a large portion of the population. 50% of the wealth was in Copt hands during the period of the British Protectorate. And the Copts have gradually been dispossessed of their wealth. The wealthier have moved away, gone to America or some other more peaceful place. And consequently, the Copts very much are dependent on support by the government of the day. Now, with the end of Mubarak, the support for the Copts disappeared. The Muslims then felt empowered to oppress, to beat up the Copts, to abduct their women. Certainly some hair-raising stories about women, young Coptic women, abducted, married against their will to Muslim men, and then, of course, because of the law of converting from Islam back to Christianity, prohibiting that, they are stuck then, and their life is one of servitude from that point on. So it's some pretty grim times for the Coptic minority.
So you can understand why they would be keen to see another change.
It depends on the sort of change. The army, I believe, would be more fair to the Copts. At least they would not be oppressive the way the Muslims are, because the Muslims regard the Copts as apostate, as opposed to the will of Allah and Muhammad, and consequently are fair game for expropriation, for intimidation. And the army is more neutral. The army are Muslim, of course, but more of secular Muslim. Many have been educated abroad in the United States, for example. They have more of a feeling of tolerance. They recognize the contribution Copts make to the economy, for example. The intellectual classes, many of them are Copts. Other leaders are Copts. And consequently, the army, I believe, is probably good news for the Copts.
It's interesting. I've heard people talk about this being something like a guerrilla democracy, or it's the democracy of the streets, in that because a lot of people in Egypt are illiterate, that they, in a written election, they have been able to be swayed. But in the movement on the streets, this is actually what the people are saying. So this is true democracy. How would you react to that?
Well, Aristotle once put down fundamentals of political science, and he would call it mobocracy. And he said this is the worst possible form of government, because the mob then turns to a demagogue. A demagogue then imposes a strongman dictatorship. And the best form of government is a mixed one, where you have an element of democracy, but also firm institutions. You have elites who are in leadership positions, but they listen to the voice of the people through a constitution, through a legislature, through an orderly executive, and with a court system to protect the rights of individuals and the minority. So we have a kind of half democracy in Egypt at the moment. And if the Muslims were re-elected and imposed Sharia law, we would have majority rule, but we would not have minority rights. Democracy in its simplest terms is just that: majority rule, but minority rights, because the minority might then become the majority in a subsequent election, and you get the two-party alternation that most people recognize as the best way in which a democracy operates.
Let's talk a bit about what this means for the region, particularly for Israel, because Egypt was what the closest Israel had to a friend in the Arab world. Obviously that changed significantly under the Muslim Brotherhood. What does it mean now that it's changed again? Is this good for Israel or bad for Israel?
I'm guessing that from Jerusalem's point of view, it's a good turn of events. The Israelis are very careful not to issue public statements, not to engage themselves in this very turbulent and unpredictable turn of events. The whole Arab Spring was one that perplexed the Israeli decision makers. They didn't know whether to support it or oppose it. The United States has been very silent and also caught in this dilemma. Do they support a military coup, which happens to be in the U.S. interest and in Israel's interest, or do they stand firm on the principle of democracy? But yes, the short answer, I would say, from Israel's point of view, the firm hand of the military and a reaffirmation of institutionalized democracy is good news for Israel.
You mentioned how Coptic Christians were leaving in droves to go to places where it's less dangerous, where it's more peaceful. This appears to be a pattern that we see across the Middle East, because I know that many Palestinian Christians have voted with their feet. And of course you have a situation in Syria where the role of the Christians is certainly, it's not looking particularly good for them either. This is a pattern, isn't it?
It's a pattern in the sense that Christians have, over the decades, with the rise of Islam in the Middle East, migrated to the United States. I believe there's something like a million Copts, for example, in the U.S., migrated to places like Georgia, Armenia, other parts. Australia certainly has a large Christian community from Egypt and the Middle East, and even New Zealand, I understand. Syria is slightly different, Alan, in the sense that the Syrian Christians actually support the current regime of Bashar al-Assad. They don't want the Muslim opposition to capture power for the same reasons that the Copts would not want the Muslims to capture power in Egypt. So it's a curious situation. Those that have money and connections and family abroad will probably go abroad. They'll take their money, their skill, their youth, their energy. Those who are trapped will support the current regime. And the great dilemma for all of us, particularly the West that seems to be supporting the opposition, is if the opposition takes over and then the opposition within the opposition, which are the radical Muslims, capture the opposition, then as in Egypt, there will be persecution of Christians, of the Alawite Shia Muslims and other minorities. So it's not a pretty prospect.
As far as the whole situation in Egypt goes, we saw what happened in the original Arab Spring. It flared up in one country and spread to others. Is this going to destabilize the whole region, do you think?
I don't think so, in the sense that each country is separate. Each Arab Spring has its own characteristic. Each country has a military, and as in Egypt, the military may step in Tunisia, in Libya and other places, and stabilize the situation. Or, as in Syria, keep the current regime in power, as in the case of Yemen, in the case of Bahrain, and other places. So and that's the perplexing things for you and me, looking at it from afar. We're looking not at one consolidated Middle East with homogeneous characteristics across the different boundaries, but with 20 Middle Easts, each country having its own characteristic. And it keeps us very busy trying to keep up with the changing combinations.
So Auddley Mansour has outlined a timetable for new elections. Is that going to be the end of it, do you think?
I think the elections will take place. The sooner the better, although probably the cautious would say, look, the Muslim Brotherhood is the best organized. Delay the elections long enough so that the moderate Muslims and the middle classes and the moderate political figures can organize their own political parties and then stand up on an equal footing to the currently better organized Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a dilemma for us. We would normally say, as good Democrats, let's have elections as soon as possible. Let's have a constitution that is even-handed, that does not recognize religion as a variable. But the reality is, given the head start the Muslim Brotherhood has, maybe a later election and support for the moderate elements in Egypt and other countries as well is the more prudent policy.
I guess we'll see. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
And that's all we've got time for this week. As ever, we'd love to hear your comments at EndZone Now, or one word, at shinetv.co.nz. Don't forget our sister programme, EndZone Focus, which this week features two remarkable couples, one which has fostered dozens and dozens of at-risk babies, and one which is facing life or death surgery. But from all of us, bye for now. Ka kite anō.